I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined this week by Brian Riedel. That's Riedl. He is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and he's an expert on federal budget issues. And we work together in Washington, D.C. So it's good to talk to you again, Brian, and welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico.
Oh, glad to be here, Paul. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so when I last worked with you, I was at National Taxpayers Union and you were at the Heritage Foundation, but you've stuck around Washington, D.C. And, really, if you follow Brian on Twitter, you'll definitely get a wealth of information, most of it, unfortunately, quite depressing, about the state of the federal budget, and talk about, the work especially, but why you've stuck with it for so long, considering that both sides, both parties seem to just want to spend.
Well, I've stuck with it because somebody needs to. It's funny, when I came to Washington, the federal budget was about $2 trillion. This was in 2001. And this year it is $6.6 trillion. So if I was paid on commission to stop federal spending, I think I would owe my bosses money. Things have gotten substantially worse, which is a testament, to my ineffectiveness working on the issue. But overall, I've enjoyed it. I see a lot of what I do as public education on this issue. I did Heritage Foundation for years. I worked in the Senate as chief economist to Senator Rob Portman from Ohio. I worked on a bunch of presidential campaigns, and now at the Manhattan Institute, I'm focusing on spending and deficits and taxes and the economy, and in particular, budget numbers that are going to get really bad. It's not just a matter of, well, we have a recession, so of course we have a $3 trillion deficit now. Things were getting really bad before the recession, and they're going to get really bad again even after the recession. This isn't a short-term problem. It's really a long-term, slow-motion disaster that we're dealing with here.
Well, the motion seems to have sped up tremendously. Of course, COVID-19, the bailouts, et cetera, have really driven the problem, but it was definitely a issue that was worsening for quite a while. Both Obama and then President Trump. George Bush before either of them. This is a nonpartisan or bipartisan problem. I think it's self-evident to a lot of folks why both parties like to spend our money, but just talk about the dynamics of the budget situation in Washington, D.C., and why it's such a challenge to get both parties to be serious about this issue.
Well, everybody likes to talk a good game about dealing with the red ink right after they're done talking about tax cuts and spending hikes. Democrats like to spend money. Republicans like to cut taxes, and they all make empty promises about it. Republicans will say the tax cuts are going to pay for themselves. Well, they really don't. Whether you like tax cuts or not, the vast majority of time they do not pay for themselves. Democrats, like to say the spending will pay for itself in terms of new investments and growing the economy and growing productivity. This is something that I dealt with a lot when I worked in the Senate. I worked in the Senate for 6 years, and I was brought in to help fix the budget, help fix runaway spending, fix Social Security and Medicare. And my 6 years there were really dispiriting because there was just no interest. The perception is that the American people do not care. The American people will punish any politician who tries to make the tough decisions, so don't even do it. Now, the Democrats have always been terrible on these issues, to be honest. Republicans live to spend money. That's why they were put on this earth. That's why it happens. Republicans at least used to talk a good game about fiscal responsibility. One of the things that happened, though, is the 2017 tax cuts. Again, there's a lot of good things in the tax cuts. I think the corporate side was really needed, but they should have been paid for. And the result of the tax cuts is that Republicans burned every bit of deficit credibility they could possibly have for a long time. So now, whenever Republicans bring up the deficit, they're immediately put on the defensive. What about the tax cuts? What about the tax cuts? Don't complain about the spending until you repeal the tax cuts. The result is Republicans aren't going to talk about the deficit now because they're tired of having to answer for the tax cuts. And, let's look at it plausibly. It's politically, you can't cut taxes for Exxon and then go cut Medicare benefits. Now, it frustrates me because the tax cuts are actually a really small part of the deficit over the long term. They're a small part. Social Security and Medicare, and I can get into the numbers, Social Security and Medicare overwhelmingly drive the long-term deficit. But the tax cuts are just enough that Republicans are tired of answering it, so they won't talk about the issue either.
Yeah, I'll push back a little bit against something you said. So you said the Democrats have been terrible on these issues. Now, a Democrat partisan who does concern themselves with the budget would say, well, the last time we had a balanced budget, the last time America kind of was moving in the right direction was the Clinton administration. Now, obviously, Newt Gingrich and the Republicans had the House for most, had the Congress for most of that time. What was it about that particular time period that allowed us to get moving in the right direction, or was it the right direction? Am I right in that? And what happened after the Clinton administration that really caused things to go in a much less favorable direction?
Yeah, the 1990s, for those who listening who are too young to remember, was a much simpler time. We had big budget fights in the early part of the decade. President Bush broke his Read My Lips pledge on no new taxes and got thrown out of office. President Clinton promised to cut the deficit, raise taxes a little bit. We had a big government shutdown in 1994 because the new Republican Congress really wanted to take deficit seriously. There were deficit deals. There was a 1997 small deficit deal. But here's the real story of the 1990s balanced budget. Congress and President Clinton had almost nothing to do with it. It was a historical accident. It was a historical accident caused by two factors. First, the end of the Cold War. Because when the Cold War ended in 1990 or 1991, defense spending plummeted. Simply because we didn't have to power ourselves to fund Europe anymore. It went from about 5.5% of GDP to 3% of GDP. This was the peace dividend. Nearly the entire spending savings in the 1990s were defense savings from the Cold War ending. That wasn't anything Bill Clinton or Newt Gingrich did. That was that was something that happened before. The other half of the balanced budget was the late 1990s tax revenue bubble. In the late 90s, the stock market caught fire, the NASDAQ caught fire. It was a giant bubble of overvalued stocks, and it led to a lot of new tax revenue coming in, and it created a huge revenue bubble. Those two factors are responsible for 90% of the deficit reduction in the 1990s. And the reason we lost it is because in 2000, the bubble burst. We went into a recession, revenues plummeted, and then in 2001, 9/11 happened. So that's why we went back into a deficit. The tax revenue bubble burst, the peace dividend ended. That doesn't let politicians off the hook, though. President Bush did cut taxes by about $2 trillion over the decade. He did engage in a domestic spending spree that made the deficit even bigger over the course of his presidency. So politicians have definitely contributed here, but the main factor between the 90s and the early 2000s was defense and then a tax revenue bubble. Although, Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich will of course take credit for it because that's what politicians do.
Right. So those were kind of the good old days. And is that something that, obviously under Trump, we've seen pretty strong stock market returns, strong economic growth. But we have not seen a similar decline in the budget situation. Is that just not going to happen again? The kind of the snowball is so big at this point that it can't turn around? Or I don't know, maybe my metaphor is not very good.
The issue going on is twofold right now. Let's set aside the pandemic, which, of course is going to create a massive deficit this year. First off, President Trump inherited a baseline deficit that is significantly increasing because of Social Security and Medicare. And again, this is the big driver of deficits. There's a myth out there that Social Security and Medicare are funded by payroll taxes and premiums. Really, payroll taxes and premiums don't even come close to fully funding Social Security and Medicare. So every year we have to transfer general revenue into the programs to pay full benefits. The amount of general revenues that are going to be needed to pay Social Security and Medicare benefits was about $350 billion when President Trump got elected. Right now, it's about $600 billion. In a decade from now, it's going to be $1.6 trillion per year. So that means the baseline deficit, no matter what politicians do, the baseline deficit, you have about $1.3 trillion in higher baseline deficits just from Social Security and Medicare. President Trump, of course, added to the deficit, though, in that the tax cuts are about $200 billion per year. And we did this big deal on discretionary spending where we busted the caps, which is also about $200 billion a year. So you have about $400 billion a year in deficits that are just the result of political decisions made between Trump and Congress, tax cuts and discretionary spending. But that $400 billion is on top of these massive Social Security and Medicare shortfalls that are in the process of rising from about $350 billion to well over $1.5 trillion per year. Until you get a hold of the Social Security and Medicare deficits, it really doesn't matter what else you do. That's the main driver.
Yeah, and Congress and the president basically can't agree on whether the sky is blue or myriad basic details of life in this in current politics. I can't imagine that they're going to get together and reform these very, popular is one way to term them, but underfunded entitlement programs. I mean, are they just going to continue on their current track until the government can't pay the bills anymore, or what? I know that's a little bit hypothetical, but do you see any political momentum building for reform, I guess, is the basic question.
None. I mean, there's a little underground movement in Congress. When I talk to members of the House and Senate and their staffs, they see the numbers and they get it. Mitt Romney has a bill called the Trust Act, which would at least begin to address the problem. It would form commissions to deal with the Social Security shortfall, the Medicare shortfall, and other trust funds like the highway shortfall. It has a couple dozen co-sponsors in the House split equally between Republicans and Democrats. There's this kind of underground movement of some House and Senate members, non-leadership usually, who see the problem. But more broadly speaking, if you look at the broad parties, no, there's no talk of any sort of grand deal to bring the parties together, because for the Republicans, if you do a grand deal, you have to put the 2017 tax cuts on the table, and that is a deal breaker for them. For the Democrats, the broad view right now is the far left is running the show, and the far left not only says Social Security and Medicare deficits are no big deal, they want 10, 20, 30, 40 trillion more on top of it. I mean, you look at Medicare for All, Green New Deal. They want to expand Medicare. They want to expand Social Security, free college, student loan forgiveness. A lot of the people on the left have gone over the cliff to the view that deficits completely don't matter, that we could run 30, 40, 50 trillion dollar deficits over 10 years, and it wouldn't hurt us at all. In that way, the idea of doing a grand deal for Social Security and Medicare is the opposite of the direction they'd go. So between the Republicans not wanting to put tax cuts on the table and the Democrats wanting to add gasoline to the fire, we're really in a position where the constraints are going to have to come externally. That can come from voters saying enough is enough, a Ross Perot type saying enough is enough, a Tea Party coming back, or more likely, it might have to come from the bond market. Eventually, what can happen is the bond market can decide, we're a little worried about the borrowing. We're not really sure you guys are good for this. And we're going to start to demand higher interest rates in order to compensate for the risk here. If that happens, Wall Street panics, the bond market panics, interest rates start to rise, which makes the deficit even bigger. The market starts to go on a sell-off. Then Congress really has to deal with it. The hope is that we don't get to that point, because then you have to be a lot more drastic. But right now, I don't see anything internally in Congress with any interest at all in dealing with this.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk a little bit about that in a minute, but this is, of course, a presidential election year, and as we record this on Tuesday, the debate, the first one between Trump and Biden, will be happening. You kind of said already that neither of them is particularly serious about addressing this issue, but it seems like every time Trump ups the ante and wants to spend more money, Biden's right behind him with an even bigger proposal for bigger government, largely driven by those progressives. So can you put a little bit of
Sure.
flesh on those proposals moving forward?
It's really hard to specify what President Trump's proposals are for a second term because President Trump really has no policy apparatus at this point. There really is no policy proposal. We know he has said he will not touch Social Security and Medicare. He talks about more defense spending. On tax cuts, he certainly is going to want to make the tax cuts permanent. He's also generally talked about things like eliminating payroll taxes, which no one really knows what he's really meaning in that. So it's really hard to tie down where President Trump is. I wouldn't expect any significant spending cuts in his second term. As for Biden, by my count, he has proposed $11 trillion in new spending over the decade. Now, it's funny because Biden's called moderate by a lot of people. And people point out that, well, Bernie Sanders wanted $97 trillion over the decade. Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris wanted $50 trillion over the decade. Biden only wants $11 trillion. That's pretty moderate. Well, if you take a look at the previous three Democrats who ran for president, John Kerry, Barack Obama, and Hillary Clinton, they all proposed $1 or $2 trillion in new spending over the decade. So Biden's $11 trillion is still miles to the left of anyone the Democrats have nominated for president, probably since LBJ. And when you take a look at a baseline deficit of $18 trillion over the next 10 years, adding $11 trillion in new spending is still going the wrong direction. He is proposing tax hikes too, about $3.5 trillion, which would be one of the biggest tax hikes in American history. But even then, you're adding $7.5 trillion in red ink. So it's kind of funny that, suddenly we're in a universe where taking the biggest baseline deficits in American history and adding $11 trillion in new spending over the decade gets you branded a moderate. I would say this is all fantasy land. There's no way this is remotely sustainable over the long term, but that's where we are right now. President Trump really has no agenda, and President Biden wants $11 trillion in new spending and $3 trillion in new taxes.
Yeah, wow. It's pretty depressing for us budget hawks, and I definitely lump myself and the Rio Grande Foundation into that group, along with you and others who are concerned with it. And it was one of the things that really made me skeptical about President Trump his first time around. But in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, I suppose. It's a pretty bad situation out there. But let's talk about kind of the ongoing battle and discussion. Obviously, the Supreme Court nominee is taking a little bit of the wind out of the sails or the attention away from the other, another COVID-related bailout. That's obviously going to accelerate the spending in Washington, D.C. if we get another one. But talk a little bit about, again, what has happened and where we're going in terms of additional COVID-related bailout spending, and maybe handicap if you think it's going to happen, because there's obviously a lot of debate in Washington on that.
Yeah, I mean, so far Congress has approved about $3.7 trillion in new assistance with COVID. A lot of this is loans. By the time it gets repaid, it'll be closer to about $2.5 or $3 trillion. Significant. I will say some of it has been justified. As much as I'm concerned about deficits, I do think that some of the spending has been needed to keep the economy afloat. I think most of it has been Keynesian policies that don't really work. But to the extent we're keeping vulnerable families and businesses from going bankrupt, that can shorten the recession and save a little bit of money in the long term. That being said, I think the odds of additional aid before January are vanishingly small. And that's, I'm sorry to put on my partisan hat on this, but the Republicans put out a $1.1 trillion proposal for additional aid, rebates for families, unemployment benefit extension, some aid for states, some aid for businesses. Democrats countered with a $3.2 trillion budget blowout with all sorts of completely unrelated and excessive provisions. Since then, the Democrats have come down to about $2.2 trillion. But, Republicans are saying you don't really need a lot of the, state and local governments right now need about 80 or $100 billion to get through the end of the year. The Democrats want to give them $1 trillion. The Democrats are putting in things like we're getting rid of the cap on state and local tax deductions so that the richest 1% can get a big tax cut for a couple $100 billion. I mean, it's basically a Keynesian bazooka that is so far beyond what we need right now. And the Republicans really have the leverage on this, because Republicans' take is, look, we're willing to do $1 trillion, but if you don't want it, if that's not good enough for you guys, we've already done $3.7 trillion, and we're happy to spend fall confirming Supreme Court nominees and confirming justices. So Democrats don't really have any leverage here with their desire for $2 or $3 trillion, because if it's a take it or leave it, Republicans will leave it. They just don't think this much works. So I've actually been a little baffled that Democrats haven't just taken the $1 trillion and then come back for more later. Instead, when given a choice between $1 trillion and zero, the Democrats seem to be taking zero.
What's your expectation? Obviously, the presidential election could impact things, but how about a scenario if Trump wins election? Where does the COVID situation go? And if Biden wins election, because we're in a blue state here, our governor, it's very likely that if Biden wins, that we expect she'll be picked up and go into his administration. But she's also desperately hoping that a pretty significant stimulus comes out. And I think a lot of blue state governors are basically putting their chips all on Biden getting elected. So he opens the floodgates to more bailouts, whereas Republican governors tend to be more aggressively reopening, getting their economies back on their own 2 feet, and aren't so focused on something coming out of Washington, D.C. I know that's kind of flipping the script from Washington to the states, but where do you see those discussions going depending on the election?
I'm seeing the same thing as you are. A lot of governors, states are not in as bad shape as they say, to be honest. What a lot of governors are doing is a lot of states have enough in their rainy day funds and their pre-19 savings and balances to actually get through the year. What a lot of governors are doing is they're purposely not spending down their rainy day funds and excess balances because they want the bailout from Washington. They would rather hold on to their money, hold on to their rainy day fund, and just have Washington pour $1 trillion into the states. So a lot of these states would actually, they could pay their bills if they wanted. They choose not to use the rainy day funds. That's the gamble they're taking, that Joe Biden's going to win, and that there's going to be a $3 trillion budget deal with $1 trillion, and that they're going to be able to do anything they want, bail out their pensions, everything. That's the gamble they're taking. However, I mean, a lot depends on who wins the Senate. We all expect the Democrats to keep the House. I think if Democrats win the White House, they're still, even under a slight Republican or split Senate, you will still probably get at least about $1 trillion. Again, Republicans are on board on the record for about $1 trillion. And I think in 2021, that could go up to $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion. I think if Democrats end up wanting to go higher than $1.5 trillion, if Democrats want to go to 2 or 3 trillion, they're going to have to either do it through reconciliation or eliminate the filibuster with a Senate majority, because I don't see any scenario by which Republicans are going to go $2-3 trillion. It's just not going to happen. So I think Republicans, I think the baseline is that we will get more stimulus legislation in the new year. Whether it's 1 trillion or 2 or 3 trillion can depend on who wins, who has the power. The view that Republicans are not going to approve anything at any point going forward, though, I think is mistaken. Like I said, they're already on the record for $1 trillion. Additionally, the more Democrats are willing to put infrastructure, which Biden has talked about, you put a lot of infrastructure in a stimulus bill. By the way, economically, infrastructure is the last thing you want to put in a stimulus bill. It's not very effective. But politically, you can pick off a lot of Republicans with infrastructure. You can buy off a lot of Republicans with pavement. So I do think whether or not we get 1 trillion or 2 or 3 trillion is what depends on the election.
Yeah, including the president. I mean, he was pushing a stimulus package less than a year ago. Well, so let's put this in perspective. Where was the budget situation before COVID-19 and after? And do you see this as a significant alteration of the path and the kind of longer term scenario of the federal budget, or is it just a little bit of a blip on the radar screen? I mean, we're like, what, 21 trillion heading into COVID. Now we're close to 27. I'm ballparking it here, but that's why I'm talking to you.
It's the long-term projections haven't changed much. It's basically a 2 to 3 year spike. It's probably a spike at this point of about, about 3 or 4 trillion. And if they do more, it could be a spike of $5 or $6 trillion. And that 5 or 6 trillion is going to be part of the budget deficit forever, because we're going to be paying interest on that 5 or 6 trillion forever. Let's say it ends up costing $5 trillion before we go back to normal. At a 3% interest rate, we're going to pay $150 billion in interest every year forever just on the COVID debt. $150 billion a year. I mean, that's as much as the Trump tax cuts, almost as much as the Trump tax cuts or free college. You're going to have $150 billion a year in interest forever just from the COVID debt at a 3% interest rate. Stepping back, though, we were headed for $1 trillion deficit this year, even before COVID. And we remain on the path that, even setting aside COVID, the deficit's going to hit about $2 trillion within a decade. And that assumes peace, prosperity, and low interest rates. If interest rates rise, we could hit $3 trillion within a decade. That's already the path we've been on. $2 to $3 trillion deficits within a decade was the peace, prosperity, low interest rate baseline. The long-term numbers are even scarier. CBO did their 30-year budget last week. They projected that over the next 30 years, we will run $104 trillion in budget deficits over 30 years. $104 trillion. Little fun number on that. Of the $104 trillion in budget deficits, they project that the Social Security and Medicare deficits are responsible for $101 trillion in deficits, and the rest of the budget is responsible for only $3 trillion in deficits. So basically what CBO said is that 97% of all writing over the next 3 decades is Social Security and Medicare shortfalls, 100 trillion in new spending and new deficits. By the end of that period, you're looking at deficits of about 12% of GDP per year and a debt of nearly 200% of GDP under the rosy scenario of peace, prosperity, and low interest rates. So even setting aside COVID, the numbers are really bad.
Yeah, no doubt about it. But they are made better. You mentioned interest rates. And of course, you only get low interest rates if you are considered a good risk for lenders. And I've seen numbers showing, a 1% increase in interest rates, how that would affect things. But people out there, taking out mortgages, my family, we're at refinancing a mortgage. I think we're at like 3.25, and that's even higher than the interest rates that we're looking at for our refinanced mortgage, down in the 2-point range. And, I guess to quote Ben Shapiro, I'm old enough to remember ... Well, when my parents had a double-digit mortgage rate out on the home, and that was very typical for the late 70s, early 80s. So, that's obviously a huge, quote, help for people in Washington who like to spend money. But, why are we in this situation? And do you see that as the tipping point or the change factor that's going to cause this whole situation to deteriorate quickly?
The interest rate issue is ultimately what keeps me up at night. The federal government is we keep hearing that, well, the federal government can afford to borrow all this money because interest rates are so low. Interest rates are so low. The government can borrow at a 2% interest rate right now. So let's go crazy. What I think that analysis misses is that all of this government borrowing is short-term interest. It's short-term borrowing. We're not locking in these rates over 30 years. We're borrowing short-term, which means if interest rates rise at any point in the future, the entire interest rate on the entire national debt rises. We're not, you're basically like a family buying a 30-year house on a short-term adjustable rate mortgage. It's great interest rates are low now. What happens when they rise in the future? You haven't locked in these rates long-term. And the numbers are really scary. Right now, the government is borrowing at rates of about 1% to 2%. But let's say at the end of the decade, the national debt's going to be about $35 trillion. Again, almost all based on short-term interest rates. Let's say interest rates rise 1% at that point. Pretty quickly, because you have to roll over the whole debt, that 1 percentage point is going to add $350 billion in interest on the national debt. If rates rise, 3%, that's $1 trillion on the national debt. Over 30 years, each point interest rates rises will cost $11 trillion in interest. So essentially what we're doing right now is we're going to build the biggest debt the world has ever seen on the hope and a prayer that interest rates stay at about 2 or 2.5% forever. Because if they rise even to 1990s levels or 2000s levels, we will be buried. Just to give you some old numbers. In the 1990s, interest rates averaged 6.9%. In the 2000s, the first decade of this century, they averaged 4.8%. And last decade, they averaged about 2.7%. Anything in those rates will bury us long term. We need interest rates to basically stay at 2% or lower, or we're in deep trouble. And not only can you not count on that for 30 years, but there's also the problem that this sort of debt by itself will raise interest rates. The debt causes interest rates to rise. And in fact, the debt we're supposed to get over the next 30 years, according to the economic consensus, would raise interest rates by about 3%. That's about what we would expect to be the interest rate effect of all these deficits. That's $33 trillion in added interest costs over 30 years. So we're essentially gambling our fiscal solvency on the hope that interest rates never rise again. If I had one recommendation for Congress right now, it would be to start locking in 30-year rates. 30-year rates are low now. Lock it in. It'll cost you a little bit more in the short term, but you need that protection. Otherwise, we're so vulnerable to rising rates.
Now, maybe this is an elementary question, but didn't they stop issuing 30-year federal debt back under George W. Bush, or have they restarted that? What's the deal with that?
It mostly stopped under President Bush. They have just started reissuing a little bit of it during the last few months. And when I say a little bit, I mean like 20 billion out of a deficit this year of 3.3 trillion. I think they issued $20 billion in 30-year bonds. But this is something Europe is increasingly moving towards 30 and 50-year debt. England, the UK is really heavily putting their stuff in 30-year debt. Germany is selling 50-year bonds, and the US is still selling everything in 3-month treasury notes, some 1 to 3 year bonds. I will say this, when Treasury was asked about doing 30-year bonds, one of the things they said is that they don't think the market wants to buy 30-year debt from the federal government. The market is pretty low on Washington with 30-year its own solvency. And when they talk to the bond markets and some of the investment houses, they said, we actually don't know if there's going to be a lot of demand for 30-year debt. But this has to be something the government is going to push, because again, if you just keep doing it short term, rates rise, you're buried.
Do you, what could cause interest rates to suddenly jump up? I mean, part of it seems to be that, and I hate to get into modern monetary theory, but I think it's worth talking about it. It seems like they're saying that as long as the U.S. is the world's currency, and other countries want to hold dollars, that we're probably not going to see the situation change much in terms of low interest rates and people willing to lend us money. But, it's like being the best looking horse in the glue factory. That's where the U.S. is in terms of its currency right now. Is there another, China would like to be that country. I'm sure every country would like to be that, but it seems like China's the only one that's up for that possible role. Is that one of the things that could change this dynamic pretty quickly?
It's not going to bail us out very well, and here's why. A decade ago, the national debt was about $10 trillion. China and Japan held 2.2 trillion of it. Hey, that was actually, pretty good, 22%. Right now, the national debt is about 23 trillion. China and Japan hold 2.2 trillion. They haven't moved in 10 years. It's been 2.2 trillion for 10 years. They haven't, in fact, of the $3.3 trillion that we've borrowed in the past year, none of it on the net was international. The holdings of China and Japan haven't risen at all combined in the last year. In fact, 60% of the borrowing this year has been funded by the Federal Reserve. The other 40% has been funded by domestic savers. If you move out for the next 30 years, we're going to add $100 trillion in new borrowing. How much of that can China and Japan reasonably borrow? Again, they've been at 2.2 trillion for a decade. They could double or triple their holdings to 4.4 or 6.6. But when the debt has already jumped up to $120 trillion, China and Japan are a drop in the bucket. I mean, they were much more important when the debt was 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 trillion dollars. When you're talking the debt levels now, their economies aren't remotely big enough to take on any meaningful portion. And same with other countries as well. Our economy is so big that when when you're talking about a debt that's going up to 200% of the American GDP, the rest of the world they cannot fund this. So I'm not sure the whole thing about the world's reserve currency and other countries will lend us money. that matters when the debt was 40% of GDP, not when it's 200% of GDP. There's just no way they can keep up with that, which kind of brings us back to the Federal Reserve. Again, the Federal Reserve financed 60% of the borrowing this year. They may have to play a bigger role, and the role they don't want to play is going to come from domestic savers. That's going to force interest rates up, along with a lot of other events that are going to force interest rates up. The retirement of the baby boomers forces interest rates up. Economic recoveries force interest rates up. You know, the long-term trend is that interest rates aren't going to stay at 1% or 2% forever.
Right. And well, we're almost to the end of our time here. I mentioned modern monetary theory. There's a group of people out there who say none of this is a problem at all. You know, briefly describe what that theory says and why it is BS, for lack of a better word.
MMT is a heterodox position held by about 10 economists, mostly at University of Missouri, Kansas City. Some of them are at, Stephanie Kelton is at Stony Brook in New York. They make the very clear and obvious point that technically government could fund itself with the printing press. We could fund government spending by just printing money. The government could just do so and not tax the money anyway. Just Treasury could spend the money through that mechanism. That's technically true. The point, though, that they then make is, and doing so would not cause inflation, and that we could in fact fund 10, 20, 30 trillion dollars, and there would be no real new inflation because there's so much slack in the economy that the money supply doesn't cause inflation. Now, when pressed, they will tell you, okay, well, yes, if you push it too far, you can get inflation. But at that point, their solution is, well, then you just raise taxes through the roof to pull the money out of the economy. So you have the government spending money with the printing press, and then if you ever have hyperinflation, just raising taxes through the roof. 99% of economists consider MMT to be essentially nonsense. The idea that the government can double or triple or quadruple the money supply without inflation flies in the face of everything we've learned about economic theory and everything we've seen in other countries. In fact, it's kind of been adopted by the left as wishful thinking. You know, people who want an excuse to spend money say, well, MMT gives me the justification to do it. But again, the argument that you can just spend all of this money and because there's slack in the economy, you won't get inflation, or you'll just get enough inflation you can solve with tax hikes. There's really just, it's just not a very serious economic theory. And if you ever want to, you know, depress yourself, get into a debate with someone from MMT who believes in MMT, because one of the things about MMT is it's a very vague theory. There's no mathematical model behind it. There's no real argument behind it. And whenever you tell them this, they'll tell you you don't really understand MMT. But when you ask them to explain it and show me the mathematical model you're using or how it works, there is none. It just kind of becomes this vague, let's wish inflation away and spend with the printing press and pretend nothing bad will happen.
No doubt about it. Well, last question for you before we let you go. And thank you very much for your time today. Well, two last questions. One is, what can people do about it? I know this is a big issue. It's kind of depressing. It's hard to get a handle on it. And two, how do they find out more about your research and arm themselves with this information?
The way to learn more about it, well, first I'll plug myself. You can follow me on Twitter at Brian_Riedel, BRIAN_RIEDL, where I'm usually posting budget charts and spending charts and economic charts. I post a lot of op-eds of mine. I post a lot of charts. Picture is a good way to do it. I also, if you go to my page at the Manhattan Institute, Brian Riedel at the Manhattan Institute, you can find by Google. I write for National Review often, the Daily Beast, the New York Post, City Journal. I write a lot for those publications on it. And in terms of, educating yourself, the Congressional Budget Office is a great website. The Office of Management and Budget historical tables are actually great. you can kind of learn that everything that you read in social media is wrong. And then from there, I think it's just a matter of, educating yourself and being active politically and kind of holding politicians' feet to the fire. They're always being asked, why won't you cut my taxes and hike my spending? Not enough people ask them to actually be fiscally responsible and look out for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So, vote with that in mind.
All right. Thank you very much for your time today. And by all means, check out Brian's information. It is not uplifting. So if you're in a bad mood, probably don't check it out, but certainly important, and not just for ourselves, but for our children and grandchildren. Thanks for listening to this week's show. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show. Now, something that could potentially require more money is the purchase of an automobile, and that could be right here in New Mexico sooner than later. Of course, California's governor made, I assume, international headlines. He certainly made national headlines that he is going to ban gasoline-powered vehicles by the year 2035. Now, that's smart move by
he'll be long gone.
Yeah.
So he'll get all the kudos, assuming that you're a person that would want to give him kudos for such a forward-thinking policy.
When Elon Musk comes up with a super battery that's able to power cars and be green and do all the wonderful things, Gavin Newsom can say, yeah, I was the guy that had that vision way back in 2020 and said we were going to go on a glide path to eliminating the internal combustion engine from California. Our governor made the decision to, by 2022, move forward to 52 miles to the gallon. That is the fuel standard that she just last year, a little bit, back in September of 2019. So we're not talking a long time ago. She didn't so much as issue an executive order or any formal legal advisory on this, but she said by 2022 model year, vehicles in New Mexico sold were going to achieve this higher miles per gallon standard. Now, we just kind of at the Rio Grande Foundation, we're questioning what happened, because politicians often make promises, and sometimes we, as in you and I and a lot of liberty-minded folks, hope they forget about them.
Yes.
And this is one that we certainly hope that long-term is forgotten about. But we're talking next year. By this time, automakers will be selling those 2022 model year vehicles, and we think that New Mexicans should wonder and ask, and somebody should be asking, what's the status of this particular promise? Is this actually something that we're going to do as a state? But we haven't heard anything from the governor, and this is a very much a looming proposition. And it's one thing to do it when times are great, oil and gas money is flowing in, but it's another thing to do it when unemployment's in the double digits. And I don't know. We're just asking that question, Wally.
Yes. So at this point, it has all the legal standing of the king and I. So it has been written, so it shall be done. Hopefully this will go away. It's one of those. The other thing is that until it's easy to say things like that. Well, what does it include? Business cargo vans, pickup trucks, other vehicles like that. But just for passenger cars alone, 52 miles per gallon is a pretty darn aggressive. That would, the last I was at a car dealership, that would mean you're probably in the small hybrid is about the only thing that could be sold under that. And, the thing about New Mexico is it is a voluminous, it is a big place. Electric cars, even if they were more affordable, the battery and charging infrastructure both have their downside. So something is going to have some gasoline in it. And I think a hybrid's the only way. Hybrids are not really too popular in spite of the fact that they actually work relatively well their market share is not, it's not like that's the consumer making that choice. So something's going to come to a head, or maybe more positive for the state of New Mexico is that this will just taper off, and we'll deal with it at another time.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see whether this just goes down the memory hole or if it is something that maybe the governor remembers suddenly after the election of 2020 is in the rear view mirror. But it is worth noting that on a Zoom meeting, yet another Zoom meeting here this week, the governor, in making a presentation to the climate change organization, she made a statement that New Mexico should transition away from fossil fuels. This is the U.S. Climate Alliance. Again, California Governor Gavin Newsom was on the Zoom meeting, a handful of governors from around the West. And this is all posted at airsoфenchantment.com. And we even point folks to the actual video. The presentation was made on Wednesday, September the 23rd. And the governor says, we should transition out of fossil fuels, which, Wally, as we do head to this election and beyond, I think anybody who does business or lives in New Mexico and cares about the private sector economy has to be wondering what will happen in the 2021 session and beyond if the legislature moves to the left. And the Democratic Party certainly has moved to the left. Whether the entire legislature, how successful the Republicans are, is an open question. But, when times were good in the oil patch, the governor was their best friend. She loved the money flowing into the state's coffers, and that was 40% of the budget. Now, it is undoubtedly a different time. The price of a barrel of oil is down, production's somewhat down, and it just seems to me that the environmentalists who support our governor and the Democratic Party in general are not going to be content with shutting a coal-fired power plant or two down in the Four Corners. They're going to be coming for the big kahuna and kick them while they're down.
And and here's the thing. So, they talk about we're going to be carbon free by certain dates. When you're talking about the utility industry, electricity, a couple of things. One, I think that means that the New Mexico gas companies of the world may have to, they may have to leave. But if you're just talking electricity, that's one thing. But where are fossil fuels used? They're used for heating in the form of natural gas. And number one, wait for it, cars and trucks, shipping, the whole gamut of transportation, much tougher nut to crack. And we do have these what I call aspirational regulations coming into place. We have no idea how we're going to get there. But when it hits the fan, a lot of these are having, as they've been put in place in Europe and other places, they've had to back away from them once you see how unrealistic they are and the damage that is done. So I have no delusions that any of these high-minded proclamations will ever come to fruition, but the way they know they've gone too far is it starts to shut the economy down, and people leave the state. In the case of the United States, go everywhere else, and they're like, okay, we went too far on that. We need to back it off and slow this down a little bit.
Yeah, you get a lot of confusion sometimes, even among relatively informed people, about what various fossil fuels are used for. And oil is used in some New England areas, parts of northeastern part of the country that use oil for electricity generation. But by and large, the rest of us use some combination of nuclear, coal, and natural gas with some renewables tossed in. And on my way over here, Wally, I was driving down I-40 and saw some windmill blades. Of course, the mining of those blades and all the metals and everything has to be done with fossil fuels. But setting that aside, the manufacturing processes, those semi-tractor trailers were most definitely not electric-powered semi-trailers. They were fossil fuels. So even the renewable industry, such as it is, gets a lot of its inputs and transportation from the fossil fuel industry. And this is kind of high-minded, theoretical rhetoric that we're much more used to politicians putting forth. 52 miles to the gallon by 2022 is a much more particular and challenging approach to public policy, and we'll see if she does that. Speaking of challenges that come up, sorry.
Oh no! Before we leave that, I just and I'll post it in the show notes, tippingpointnm.com. There's the Lawrence Livermore energy flow chart that in sixth grade it's where do babies come from. This is where does energy come from and where does energy go. And it's a fantastic chart. It takes the whole United States and it shows all the sources of energy from a source point of view: petroleum, natural gas, nuclear, renewables, and then where it goes through the economy. It's pretty easy to understand. So you've probably seen it, but I found that's the best chart to just say, oh, okay. So here's where the real issue is that we have to work on if we're serious about changing the emissions and the sources of energy in the United States.
Yeah. Yep. That is a useful chart. I know what you're talking about. All right. Well, speaking of policies that looked really fun and exciting when unemployment rates were really low and the oil and gas industry was booming, we have the governor and the legislature. Now, remember, this was a compromise at the time in 2019, but the minimum wage is going up at the end of 2020 in New Mexico. It's going to be, as of January 1st, 2021, $10.50. With the following year going to $11.50, after that in 2023 to $12. Now, that plausibly could be fine if you're close to full employment and things are really booming in New Mexico, but I will remind people, once again, we are at 11.3 unemployment in the state. I suspect we are not going to get anywhere near 5% by the end of the year, and there's plenty of businesses that are struggling, and more, theaters and airlines are laying off people all the time. So I suspect we are going to be in a long-term economic struggle, let alone a virus-related struggle. And, it's just policies that seem really nifty and fun when times are great, then things change. And I think this is going to be a tremendously harmful mandated wage increase that is going to happen at the end of the year. I really suspect that the governor will do nothing to address it. Of course, she's spending all her time trying to convince businesses to do their part to get New Mexico's economy going, let alone what the government's boot on the neck of businesses is doing. But referencing previous talker in the podcast here. But I suspect that the governor will allow the minimum wage increases to continue. And, this is kind of a 1-2-3. I wish I could say it was just a 1-2 punch for business, but I think up to now we're talking about more of a Mike Tyson situation. We're a 5th or 6th punch in.
Yes.
And they're heavy punches at this point. And this will be a difficult blow for a lot of those businesses, especially small ones, but certainly not limited to them in terms of how they move forward economically in New Mexico.
Well, and one of the other punches that I think is going to be huge that, frankly, may be as big of a weight on economic recovery as these minimum wage increases, possibly a lot larger, is the unemployment insurance. That fund is out of money. And so, where does the money come to replenish that? And so we've talked on the podcast before, if that comes in the form of draconian raises in unemployment insurance for employers without, a period of time to allow for that, or additional monies coming from the CARES Act and other places that potentially could be used to restore that fund, but in New Mexico hasn't, you're going to be faced with higher minimum wage to hire people, lots higher unemployment insurance potentially. And the thing about the minimum wage is, at least when you pay that to an employee, the employee is getting it right then, and it tends to be a motivator in terms of maybe you could get a better better employee if the wage is higher, not getting into all those arguments. But that unemployment insurance is just like money you're putting into the system that, yeah, is there a benefit for it? Yeah, but you as an employer don't see it right then. And certainly the employee you're just hiring doesn't see that is a big factor and doesn't give you any credit for those rates being a lot higher.